Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here for the first of the webinar series on racial equity that the Greater Houston Partnership is hosting. I'm Jenny Phillip, Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer here, and has been working on our racial equity work, which we launched last week under the title One Houston Together. And really this work is looking at three broad areas. The first is building a shared understanding on issues such as race. And so this webinar series, especially this first one, is meant to be a foundational discussion on racial equity, justice, and really being able to dig a little deeper, as much as a 1-hour webinar allows us to, on these issues. The second part of One Houston Together is really looking at what are those structures within the partnership ourselves as an organization that needs to change to be able to do some meaningful work in terms of addressing racial equity and justice in Houston. And for those of you who have been members of the partnership for some time or familiar with our organization, you'll know that that does require quite a bit of leaning into and thought, because what we want to do is have meaningful sustained action, and that does require changes to our structures, including our board, our committees, et cetera. And the final area is developing programmatic and policy solutions that we could advance in Houston, across the state, and even on the federal level, depending on the issue. And so those are things that we are currently working on. So stay tuned. All of that will be, rolled out over time as they become developed. But for today, we are here to have just a start of a conversation. And we are so thankful for the many of you who have decided to join this conversation. And we know that everyone is at a different place in understanding race. We're all in a different place in our learning journeys on this. Some of us have had deep self-reflection, a deep inventory of our behaviors, our actions, and our thoughts. Others may have not wanted to think about this for various reasons. And some may be at a very different place on this. And what we hope to do today is that whatever it is that brings you here, first of all, thank you for being here. And thank you for participating. And so whatever it is that brings you here, please be fully engaged in this 1 hour. And we know that webinars, we are zoomed out. So as much as you can, turn your phone off, flip it over, try not to check emails or texts. Let's really try to be engaged in this discussion. There is an opportunity for questions where you can, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A area where you can go and provide questions for me to ask Melanie. If there are other questions that can be answered, we have moderators behind the scenes who can help with answering some of those as well. And then we will have opportunity for Q&A at the end. So if there are things that come up in the discussion that I have with Melanie that strike a question for you, feel free to chime in there. If you have some just kind of a thought and not necessarily a question, that's what the chat feature will be for. So just so you know, this is meant to be as interactive as possible given a virtual setting, but really we want to be able to fully take this 1 hour so that it's not just about what happens in the 60 minutes, but also what we discuss that you carry forward. And at the end, we'll talk about what can be done that's actionable, and what can be done not just individually for yourself, but also in your communities, in your organizations, to really be an agent of change on these issues. So with that, I will jump in. Dr. Price, thank you for being here. Really appreciate the time. School has started. I think, in fact, you have a class you need to go to teach right after this.
Right after this, yes.
So thank you for taking the time. Maybe some of your kids are earning extra credit right now by listening in. So Dr. Melanie Price is the Endowed Professor of Political Science at Prairie View A&M University, our neighbors up to the north. And she's been also tapped to lead the university's recently announced Center for Race and Justice. And we'll hear about that later in this session. Dr. Price's full bio can be found on the webinar webpage, and I believe there will be a link that will be shared in the chat. But we want to make sure we can dedicate as much time as possible to conversation. So let me kick it off with just this very big question, or a series of questions that entire books, multiple books have been dedicated to this. So it's a little unfair to start here.
Yes, no.
But, you know, what is racism, right? What is race? We hear about it talked about as a social construct, as a biological construct. You know, how does racism exist in us as individuals, as a society, in our policies, in our systems? Kind of help unpack that all for us.
Well, let's start with racism first. When I like to talk about racism, I like to start with this most basic thing, and that is racism or any kind of discrimination really comes out of our brain's desire to sort out lots of information, right? To understand who is our enemy, who is our friend, who is our family, who is not, who is a stranger, who is not. And so initially our brain is always looking to identify people, things, places, and understand where they fit in how we understand the world. The example I like to use with my students is if you've ever been in a game of tug of war, or if you've ever been in played hangman when you were in elementary school. And so there's a way in which you're all the same class when you play a game in the class. But the minute the teacher divides the class in half, left side of the room versus right side of the room, you become enemies, right? Because now you have identified the other side of the room as people who are not you. Really, racial prejudice and other kinds of prejudice is an extension of that. Only we've built this whole infrastructure on top of it that says, not just that the people across the room are not me, but they are my enemy, they are less than me, they are somehow pathological, they are inherently violent, they don't have the same principles that I have. And so we build a whole kind of narrative on top of this tendency to separate ourselves that then leads to racial discrimination and racist thinking. And so it's our job is to then say, is this true about this person? Or are they just someone who is different than me, right? Mm-hmm. And so we have also put an infrastructure on that suggests that people who are different from us are also somehow biologically different. That is, that there was a time during slavery when they would say that the fact that Black people's musculature and their small brain size makes them more able to be subservient, right? And there's a way that we use all of these things to explain differences. And the racist part really comes not, so let me just say this. There's a difference between recognizing racial difference. That is, I am African-American, you are Asian-American, right? That's recognizing racial difference. But if I then started to go on and say, because I am African-American, I'm a better dancer than you. And because you are Asian-American, you are better at math than me. Like, that's when the racism happens. It's not that we notice our differences. It's that if we attach harmful, negative, destructive stereotypes to people who are different from us, that's where the racism comes in, right? And a lot of that is really built on how we understand society or the narratives that have been created in society.
So, touching on that or just being more direct, a lot of people say, I've always said I'm colorblind. I don't see race, I see everyone as equal, so just there's issue with saying, I'm colorblind.
Those are two different statements, right?
Exactly.
I see those as two different statements. One, I see everybody as equal. Yes, you should. I don't see race. I'm colorblind. That's just absolutely, unless you're actually colorblind, that's just actually not true. And if it's not true, then what do you get from saying it? And in fact, it is important in a place like America, where we have actually used racially targeted policies to discriminate against people, to actually pay attention to race, to pay attention to color. Because when you recognize that, you can see the ways in which certain people are discriminated against based on race because of particular policy. And in a country where there were hundreds of years of intentionally seeing race and doing something about it that negatively impacted particular groups, than to just all of a sudden decide that you don't see it really doesn't help to remedy what has happened before or to reconcile how you won't do it anymore going forward.
Absolutely. And, I think what has been difficult is we as a society have become very sophisticated in disguising our racism, whether it's the way we talk to each other or the policies we put in place, whether it's our organization or our democracy. Could you, highlight or, talk about, there's some that are very obvious, right, that the civil rights movement addressed, but we could even say since then that there have been ways that policymakers or other individuals have found ways around it to create essentially systemic racism that we experience.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we don't have to go that far back. Let's think about 2007, 2008, 2009, right? And the economic recession that occurred there, much of it around housing, much of it around the real estate bubble. And so if we think about that, we know, for instance, that African Americans lost an enormous amount of wealth in 2007, 2008, 2009. And they lost that wealth primarily because most African American wealth is in the property that they own, their houses. And when the housing market collapsed, they lost value in their houses, which meant they also lost wealth. But not just that, if you look at foreclosures around that time, and there were many of them, the thing that you'll see is that African Americans and Latinos were more likely to be foreclosed on, not because they couldn't pay, but because most of them, even when they qualified for traditional 30-year loans, were offered and given only predatory loans from banks like Wells Fargo, like Bank of America. And so that's a systemic problem. That is, there is a way that I could have given you a loan because you have a particular credit score, you have a particular educational background, you make a particular salary. There's a way I could have given you a loan, a traditional 30-year loan that I offer people all the time, but instead I give you this balloon mortgage loan that I know is gonna blow up in your face, but there's a way that I profit off that, right? And so there are all kinds of ways. There's also something, for instance, that we could use called the racial empathy gap, right? And that is, there are all kinds of psychological studies where literally it turns out that people believe, these are mostly black-white studies. And so I want to say that I know we don't live in a black-white world and Houston is not a black-white city, but this example is a black-white example, where people believe that Black people can tolerate more pain physically. And so what that means is, if you look at, some of the studies looked at emergency room charts and people who were coming in presenting the same symptoms, it took longer for them to offer African Americans medicine that might ease that pain, right? Those are the ways in which discrimination happens, but you don't necessarily see it. And you could also disguise it and say, well, this person is different from that person. But if we systemically look at it, then if it was just chance that this was happening, then you wouldn't see as many disparities. And I think it's the disparities that tell us that the systemic racism continues to exist. The only other explanation for it is Black people are terrible with money, and so that's why they lost their houses. Black people are pain seekers and they exaggerate their symptoms, and that's why we don't give them as much pain medicine. And those kinds of explanations we can all easily see as problematic, right? We can easily see that saying that Black people are just bad with money is not a good thing to say. But to say that, well, you know, people make bad financial choices, everybody makes bad financial choices, but we know that lenders were systematically preying upon African Americans, that's systemic discrimination.
Yeah, and we're seeing some of that unfold right now, right? In the COVID environment and the way that the PP.
I didn't even think to use COVID. That was like the easiest example.
Hey, that's what I'm here for.
Said COVID, and then I would have went right to it. Sorry.
No, but it's true. There's, because even to be able to come out of the Great Recession, some people were able to recover. But from what you're saying, not only were they not able to recover, but they were further damaged by the Great Recession. Now there's COVID on top of that as well, right? And so do you want to talk through,
Yeah, COVID is a good example, right? So it's not just that COVID seems to have a negative impact on people with multiple comorbidities, and African Americans tend to have comorbidities. But let's talk about how those comorbidities work, right? A lot of that is around sort of diet. A lot of that is around high blood pressure and diabetes. It's about questions of obesity. And you could say that all of those things are about poor discipline. And lots of people say it. But it's also about the fact that African Americans are more likely to live in food deserts. They're more likely to live in places where all the restaurants are fast food. They're more likely to shop at grocery stores that have lesser quality produce. And so there's a way in which the societal constraints also position them into making the kinds of choices that they have, right? So lots of people have the ability to maybe, I could drive from my inner city neighborhood to Richmond and say, oh, get to the Whole Foods and get to other stores. But if you don't have that capacity, you go with the place that's closest to you. And if the place that's closest to you is offering substandard produce, is not offering as many kinds of options as they would in other stores, then that means that I'm going to end up with a worse diet and also end up with worse health, right? And so behavioral choices are also constrained by the options that people have in order to make those choices. And so that's the kind of thing that we need to think about. So COVID is impacting people with comorbidities. Black people tend to have more of these comorbidities, but it's not just that. It's how many stories we've heard of Black and Latino people who were sent home and had to wait until they got sicker. It's also about the ways in which African Americans, and I think to some extent other minority groups, understand that your doctor may not always listen to you. Your doctor may not be an expert on what it's like, how Black people might explain health concerns. That is how they might talk about them. And so there's a question of cultural sensitivity. And so all of those things matter. And so, for example, my mom has been sick in this process and she had a problem with her heart. And so she is completely disoriented, but we have to drop her off at the emergency room. And of course, you know, during the early period of this, you just had to drop the person off and leave. And in that moment, my mother, who is old, Black lady with gray hair, she'd been a nurse at MD Anderson for almost 40 years. But in that moment, we were concerned that she didn't have anybody who could advocate for her, anybody who could be there, who was completely lucid, who could say that this is not some strange, this is not whoever you think she might be, this is a woman who matters to people. And I don't think that everybody who goes to the doctor has those kinds of concerns. I don't think everybody who shows up in the emergency room says to themselves, I wonder, will they think that I'm on drugs rather than I'm actually have a real problem. And the minute you have to do that kind of mental work just to step into an emergency room when you already have a reason for being there, then that's the thing that I think we have to start thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an exercise of empathy, right? To understand.
It's empathy. It really is. Yeah.
And you know, on the COVID vein, there's some thought of what has been happening in America, across America. You know, there's because of the disproportionate impact of COVID, especially on the Black population. You know, there was already this, you know, kind of, there's something simmering already,
right?
But you could also say there are decades, centuries of that too. So what is it about what happened since the killing of Mr. Floyd, and then most recently what happened last week with Jacob Blake? You know, like what is happening right now? Do you feel like there is something different when people say this time it feels different? Yes. Do you think that to be true, and why is that?
I actually do think that to be true, right? I think one of the things that we know about mass social movements, that is mass protests, if you think about the civil rights movement, if you think about women's rights, equal rights, is that oftentimes these kinds of mass protests come about because society is in its own sort of upheaval. And when American society is trying to figure out itself, trying to understand where it goes next, trying to sort of make a plan for where do we go from here, that's often the time where it's also possible for society to entertain questions about race, to entertain questions about gender, about inclusion, racial inclusion, gender inclusion, inclusion around sexuality, right? It's in those moments of disruption where everything is up in the air, that you can throw those balls up in the air and start to deal with them, right? And so we have this moment where we are in a pandemic, where we are on the moment of who knows what kind of economic fallout. Everybody is at home trying to figure out what's going on with their lives. And then you have this movement that has been going on for years, where people have been talking about, police and vigilante violence against Black bodies. And so I think all of those things come together in this moment to make it seem like a different moment. But you should also know it's a different moment because you look at how corporations, how governmental institutions, how educational institutions are responding to it, right? So when Trayvon Martin was shot, there was no Black Lives Matter section on Netflix. There was no, Center for Race and Justice being created on many campuses. There were none of these things happening. There was no Amazon money being donated to HBCUs. And the fact that you see a response from people also suggests that we're in a different moment.
And what do you hope comes out of this different moment?
My hope is that we actually start to settle some of the questions that we've been asking over and over again. As a person who has taught African American studies and who has taught Black politics for years and years, that one of the things that we know is that oftentimes the biggest thing that goes wrong in America is that we open ourselves up to these questions. We open ourselves up to ask them. And then we do really great work. We make really great strides. We do things that really sort of move us forward, that live up to the greatest ideals of this nation, that make it the democracy that we all pledge allegiance to. And then we say, okay, now we're done. We've done it. Let's go back to normal. But you have to understand is the minute you say, let's go back to normal, is the moment that you start undoing the progress. You have to decide that this is going to be a new normal, that going forward, this will be what the world looks like. This will be what my life looks like. And so there cannot be this effort to restore normal. That isn't the same thing as saying people are going to be protesting in the streets for the rest of our lives.
Right.
But it does mean that our institutions should look different going forward. They should be more inclusive, that our television shows should look different, that our friend groups should look different, that our, the people who our children play with should look different, right, going forward. And that is the thing that we have the possibility to do now. And that is the thing that I'm hoping actually happens. Not that we move through this moment and we say, I'm tired of this, let's just go back to the America that I understand. Because that America inherently was less inclusive than anything we do going forward.
Yeah, and I would hope that there is that new normal that comes out of this. But I think for many of us who are on this and are people of color, when there is a new normal, there are those who are very uncomfortable by that new normal, either because they see that they are losing something from it, or a variety of reasons. So what would make that new normal something that could be sustained and not kind of further create tensions, or sort of this quiet other side of things that will just also bubble up in different ways?
Sure. The first thing I would say is all change is uncomfortable. All of it. I mean, lots of us have gained 15 pounds in this pandemic moment. And now we have to think about going back to work and putting our clothes back on. That's change. That's change. It's uncomfortable, right? So all change is uncomfortable. That's the way we do it. And I love, because I'm a teacher. I mean, I teach, college, but because I'm a teacher, I love to use examples of children. And it's like children are uncomfortable with every stage. I mean, you should know this better than me, Jenny, right? Children are uncomfortable with every new stage, right? And so you send them to kindergarten and they cry, but you don't say, look, school is over now. Let's go home. You don't have to do it again. And so there's a way in which, if you believe that equality, that justice, that in order for me to make this world better, these are the changes that I have to do, then you have to keep doing them until they become comfortable, right? Until you adjust, until you have made the changes that you believe to be true, right? It's not that you then say, this is uncomfortable, so I'm gonna quit. It's uncomfortable because you probably don't do it enough. I'm very comfortable talking about race. Why? Because I do it like every day. I mean, there's not a day that I probably don't have some discussion about race. And if you do it every day, then you become better at it, right? If you check yourself around the stereotypical thinking you have every time you do it, then you'll actually find yourself having to check yourself less because you'll stop doing it. And it's that sort of thing that's important.
Is that, I guess that could be our sort of first actionable item is check yourself. ask yourself the questions. Yeah.
Ask yourself when you're driving through your community, you know, and you see a person who you think that person shouldn't be here. What do they look like? Why shouldn't they be here? Is it because their car is cheaper than the cars I normally see around here? Is it because, you know, this is a place for retired citizens and this person is 22? Is it because this person just is Black and I know there aren't a lot of Black people in this neighborhood or on this street? And so automatically seeing a Black person on this street makes me think there must be trouble, rather than say the person got lost, rather than say somebody on your street has a Black friend, right? Ask those kinds of questions of yourself, and you have to do it each and every time until you get comfortable with saying, look, maybe that person is just here. And I really encourage that, particularly around thinking about crime, because there's lots of discussions, particularly when moments like Jacob Blake happen, when moments like George Floyd happens, where people say, well, there's Black on Black crime. And so nobody ever protests because of Black on Black crime. And then I have to say to people, almost all crime is intraracial. That is, if you're going to, if a crime is being committed upon you, it's more likely to be a person who is of the same race than you. And so really looking around, if you're white, you should be looking at other white people and thinking, which one of them is going to rob me? Not these Black people, because statistically more likely that crime is going to be committed by somebody who is the same race as you. And so if we think about it that way, we're not protesting Black on Black crime because we're not protesting white on white crime. We're not protesting Asian on Asian crime. And so start thinking about things in that way, and actually let the statistics about what is likely to happen to you be a better guide than the fear that often exists in other places.
Absolutely. And I think further on the question of you know, when you journey around Houston, let's say, and I would say the majority of the people who are on this are in Houston, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if we were to start from like the moment you leave your neighborhood and your home and what you see, right? And we both grew up in Houston, actually. We're both native Houstonians. So, but we can also say that there are very different experiences based off of which zip code you grew up in and, frankly, the color of your skin.
I mean, that's certainly true. And we both know that. I should say, by the way, that this notion of people not belonging, it isn't just like you say, Black people don't belong in this neighborhood. I was just thinking about when you said this, how one of my best friends growing up was Vietnamese, and he lived in the neighborhood. I grew up in Sunnyside and he lived in Sunnyside, right? And so his mom, I remember being in the car one day, and it's like, you know, his mom is Vietnamese, he's Vietnamese. Me and my twin sister were both Black. And we see these white people in the neighborhood, and his mother is like, what are they doing here? It's like everybody asks those kinds of questions.
About it, yeah.
But the thing is not asking the question, it's how you then explain that question, right? That you have to really sort of reconcile and ask, you know, are we asking good questions? I'm not saying that you should just see everybody as not a threat. I'm saying you shouldn't only see certain kinds of bodies as threats. But I should also say that when I was in grad school, this might be a good exercise for people, but when I was in grad school, I used to make my students, they would have to get on a bus line, just any bus line in the city. and take it from beginning to end. That is, you go on one bus line, all a crosstown bus line throughout the whole city.
Yep.
Take it from one end all the way to the other. And I want you to think about how things change, not just the people. What's the quality of the streets? What kinds of businesses are in that neighborhood? How do the houses look? How do the bus stops look? Do you have a little, covering and a place to sit down with lights? Or is it just a thing on the street, right? Or is it just like a sign on the street that says stop here, right? What do these things look like? And one of the things that it starts to teach you is that we are all from Houston, but we all don't experience it the same way, right? I spent my middle school and high school years being bused out of Southeast Houston. I went to Lanier, I went to law enforcement, being bused to those schools. And one of the things that busing taught me is that, or people like me, is that if I want my child to get a certain kind of education, they can't stay here where they live. They have to go elsewhere, right? You're teaching your children a racial lesson. The city is teaching us a racial lesson, right? The school district is teaching us a racial lesson. That is, these schools where predominantly Black children are not as good as Lanier. We can undo that by making those schools better, right? We can undo that by ensuring that certain kinds of wraparound policies that those kids need in those schools is available. But that's not the lesson I got when I was in the 6th grade. It was that my mom was like, she had 4 other children. All of them had started college, none of them finished. And when it came down to her last 2 children, my mother said that she was talking to a woman she worked with who was also Black and also a single mother, who had sent all of her kids to college. My mom said she asked the woman, how do I do this? And the woman told her, what you have to do is put your children in a place where everybody in the school goes to college, no questions. And that wasn't where I lived.
Yeah.
That was somewhere else, right?
Yeah.
Now, all of my other sisters eventually went on to college. They finished college. They did it at a later date. But my twin sister and I, we're the only ones who went straight through, right? And it was because nobody asked in my high school, are you going to go to college? Everybody applied. Even if they didn't finish, they went. And that's the kind of thing that we have to think about. How are people experiencing Houston differently? Mm-hmm. Based on race and income.
And actually there's a question from Mark Grossberg, who's attending, and he and so it's not, he's asking kind of the age question too, right? So there's how we experience it, likely in the same age bracket, but then is there a perspective, not right or wrong, an approach from a different experience, a viewpoint from someone who is about in the 1960s that's missing. So there's a way that we grew up. And then, so how would you kind of address Mark's question there?
I mean, sure. So, literally the neighborhood that I'm sitting in right now turned over from Black to white in the 1960s. That's 3rd Ward, right? Turned over from Black to white in the 1960s. And part of that is the way lots of neighborhoods were turning over racially across the country in the 1960s and 70s. It went from being predominantly white to being predominantly Black. And there's lots of transition across place and space in cities. The thing I think people need to think about is that cities are dynamic and evolving process, are a dynamic and evolving process. And the thing that we need to keep foremost in our minds is when you move to a new place, who used to be here, right? And when I move to a new place, who might I be displacing? Is the displacement necessary, right? And so was it necessary for this neighborhood to turn over? Probably not. But our thinking about race, our thinking about what it meant to live next to people who are different race than us was different, hopefully, than it is now, right? And so now this neighborhood is going through a new transition where some of the grandchildren of the people who lived here before now see it as an okay place to live. And so when they move in, what does that mean then to the people who are already here? And I think that's the kind of question that cities always have to be asking itself. And that is, as we shuffle around, as neighborhoods become the new hot neighborhood, what was there before?
Mm-hmm. And I think another,
people, right, I'll
yeah.
stop there. Mm-hmm.
No, but I was saying, I think another way to look at it too, why is it that the people who are moving in, let's say predominantly white,
yes,
upper income, upper education, then bring along additional resources,
right,
in terms of investments.
They bring home additional resources,
store, yeah,
additional taxes.
Yeah.
So that means that the old people who might be living there already, who were hanging on to that property, might not be able to hang on to it in the same way. There's lots of ways in which we need to think about. It's all about, for me as a teacher, my focus is on two things. That is on critical thinking and radical empathy. Not that I have to accept your position, but I have to actually, not that I have to say your position is going to be my position, but I have to think about why it is you might be doing this thing. You can't be a teacher unless you think that, because otherwise you think people are just asking questions to annoy you. And that is no way to be a teacher. So you have to ask yourself, why is it that they're asking this question in this way? Why is it that they're doing this thing in that way? And if you spend some time thinking about that, it isn't always satisfactory, because sometimes kids actually ask questions just to be annoying. But also sometimes it's because they come from a different background. They don't know this. Lots of times for me, it's because they're too young. And so the reference that I just made means absolutely nothing to them. All of my pop culture references are for me as a child who, grew up in the 80s and 90s. These kids know nothing about it. And so when I mention it, they're like, what? It's all of those kinds of things that we have to think about.
Let's transition from the conversation about the communities we live in to our places of work.
Yes.
And since the partnership, we're primarily a business-driven organization with most of our members, ranging from small businesses to Fortune 500 companies. There's quite a bit of work that has been done in diversity and inclusion and equity for decades, right? But we're obviously not seeing the sort of radical change that we would hope to see after decades of work in this. And so why do you think that, I have my hypothesis, and there's a reason why, this webinar isn't just focused on corporate D&I, but it's to say we need to sort of peel things back and really look at the core of who we are. And D&I doesn't work if the individual employees aren't comfortable talking about race, don't know how to identify what is racist within themselves or around them. And I'll finish with this, that there was someone who is attending today's webinar who emailed us ahead of time and said, what's going to be different about this time, right? In terms of what does this webinar series offer? And granted, yes, 60 minutes can offer very little, but in terms of if you take from this and move it forward in what you do, and hopefully create new questions and discomfort and dialogue in your places of work, we hope that to be helpful. But the hard part of what was shared in this email was, this person has been at this company which is considered probably one of the more, they have very strong diversity and inclusion statements. You would assume them to be one of the more advanced in this space, and received an anonymous email to say, go home. And you think about how, and I'm sure that is not the first time this person has been at the receiving end of something chilling like that. Others, that are attending here too can recount, also their experiences. And so kind of thinking about how much emphasis has been placed on kind of corporate D&I work, but how little has been accomplished. What can we do differently?
Okay. All right. So remind me at the end of this to talk about individual versus structural racism, right?
Absolutely. Sure.
I just can't, I won't remember it. So the first thing I should say is the thing that I hope will be different is that in this discussion, I really am, if you notice, am trying to focus on the interpersonal ways that we can change this. And I think that's important because oftentimes The reason why people are reluctant to admit that they hold racist beliefs is because we have attached the idea that they hold the racist beliefs at all to the fact that they're a member of the Klan. Well, we've also said that all racism has to look like the Klan. But if you have any racist beliefs, you are a horrible person. But when in fact we know that's probably not true, it's that if you listen to lots of things that you hear just on an everyday basis in society, if you just watch television, if you just watch the news, then there's a way in which there are stories that get told that say that Black and brown people are dangerous every day. Their neighborhoods are dangerous. They're dangerous. There's always shooting there. And so you believing that is a natural outgrowth of the things that you hear. That doesn't make you a bad person. What becomes a problem is if you know then that you believe that and you don't figure out how to fix it, right? If you don't figure out how to fix it, then when you go to work and you're having a discussion with, say, an African-American person, woman that you don't, I'll just say this because it's happened to me several times, where they say, well, no, I disagree with you, Lindsay is a woman on this call, that's what I'm telling you. I disagree with you, Lindsay. And then Lindsay says, don't get mad, girl. They shake their heads like that. And I'm like, wait a minute, was I doing that? Or was I just saying that I disagree with you? Was I actually doing anything stereotypical in that way? Or do you hear it that way because you watch a lot of reality TV, right? And so now I'm offended. Lindsay probably thought it was an accident. Lindsay has never done this to me. Let me share that. But, Lindsay is like, wait a minute, I was just joking. But I say, well, I take that offensively because it's a stereotypical way of thinking about Black women, yeah. Right? It's that kind of thing that leads to diversity and inclusion programs can't fix that.
Yeah.
It isn't, because it's interpersonal reaction. It's interpersonal interaction. Diversity and inclusion programs can't control what happens in the break room. And it's in those moments that you really have to think about how it is you're talking to people who are different from you across racial lines, across class lines, across gender lines, across all of those lines. And it's funny because we were talking earlier, and it's like, it's not just whether or not you would be offended if I did that to you. That's not as important as whether or not I'm offended that you did it, right? Because the things that trigger you, I should also try to avoid those things as well. So individual and structural racism, the thing I wanted to say about it is, sometimes the problem is we see structural racism and we act like the people who are implementing the policies are also necessarily racist themselves. And the thing that we need to understand is that there are some policies that have been put in place that are already discriminatory, and it doesn't matter whose job it is to implement them, right? And so one of the reasons why people need to work on their individual racism is because we need you to be able to recognize racial discrimination and racist policies when you're making them. Because then once they're put into place, then it doesn't matter, right? So all of these police shootings that we've had across the country, they're not all white cops. Everybody involved in George Floyd, they're not all white. Because part of the thing is, we have to ask ourselves is there a way that policing automatically sees Black bodies as criminal, and then the way we train them then augments that no matter what the race is, right? And so you can be a Black cop, you can be a white cop, you can be an Asian American cop, you can be a Latino cop, you can be a Native American cop. But if I have told you that Sunnyside, the neighborhood where I grew up, is a war zone, and every time you go in it, you need to be prepared for war, and even the little babies are criminals, and everybody over there is a criminal, every time you interact with a person in that community, it's going to be framed by that, right? Doesn't matter what your race is. And so we need to understand the ways in which we need to fix systems, because systems can perpetuate problems, whether the individual who is made to implement those problems are actually racist themselves.
Yeah, and I think that the distinction here, and what I hope a lot of people take away from this is that, yes, there's individual, there's systemic, they feed into each other, right?
They do.
And I think a lot of times when we narrow down the scope of racism to being something more individual,
Right.
You kind of forget that the mutually reinforcing piece of the systemic part of it. But it can also feel very overwhelming on an individual perspective of, let's say, someone who wants to be an ally, or someone who sees something at work or in their community, and they want to do something and say something, perhaps for an individual, or in a different space. What would you say? Let's create a scenario where it's in the workplace,
Yes.
like during a meeting, and there's an exchange that you just highlighted, right? And a microaggression or something happens,
Yes.
that, and I think the other thing we're also noticing is that it shouldn't always be on the person who is receiving the microaggression,
Right.
to have to kind of, let's not necessarily fight back or address it. So what could
Right.
somebody else who sees it do to address that?
I mean, there are lots of things. I think the worst thing that could happen to me is if a person who sees it happening makes it a whole thing, right? So then it becomes worse. But there is a way that you can say to that person, I don't think that's cool what you just did, right? How would you feel if we engaged in a stereotype about you or some identity that you have in this same way, right? Just say it, and say it so that the person who's experiencing it doesn't have to always be the person who is addressing it, right? Because what then starts to happen is the person who experiences this starts to feel isolated, not just from the person who's doing it to them, but everybody in the room. At a school I used to work at, there was a dorm where somebody was putting racist stuff on the mirrors in the bathroom. And so I go to talk to these kids, as resident Black person, I go to talk to these kids about why I think they should stop doing this. Anyway, that seems ridiculous in and of itself. But I go to talk to them, this is in the 2000s, and I go and talk to them about why this should not be happening. But the other thing that I point out to them, and I like to point out in these situations, is that if I show up in a bathroom in a dorm where I live, or if I show up in a break room where I work every day, and there might be one person who is just like a reprehensible racist, and I know every time I go to heat my food up, I'm going to have to run into that person. That's horrible. It really is. But to know that I'm the only one who is having to deal with this, to not have anybody else say, this is a problem, to be the only one who is sort of bearing the brunt of this, it also then makes me start to question the other people around me. Mm-hmm. Are you okay with this? Is this something you approve of? Are you cool with people being treated like this? Are you really my friend? Do I want to get drinks with you after work? It's like those kinds of things, they start to build on themselves. And then you might end up saying, oh, well, she never comes to dinner with us. We go out all the time and she never comes, but it's also because I don't feel like you are a person who's actually on my side. And the thing that I started to tell them is sometimes, especially when things are done anonymously, everybody gets painted with that brush, whether you want to or not. And in the same way that when Black people do things, we are then asked to explain why this thing is happening as a Black person, then there's a way in which when I'm experiencing sexist things and there are men there who don't say anything because they don't want to ruffle the feathers of whoever the guy is that's doing this, I then start to wonder, can I trust them as well, right? Are they really my allies as well? Are they people who I actually want to spend time with? Are they people who I want to work on a project with as well? It's the way we all get, if we don't condemn these things, we all become accomplices in them.
Right. Actually, there's someone who had just written that in the chat about the accomplice piece of it. With the last few minutes, I'm going to look, kind of click through a lot of the Q&A questions. Mm-hmm. There's one from Christy McKay, and this goes back to our conversation about essentially gentrification, specifically in Houston. So,
yes.
Houston neighborhoods are gentrifying at a rapid rate, which have pros and cons depending on who you ask.
Yes.
Love more information on gentrification and what we can do within our communities to maintain diversity throughout Houston and not have segregated communities. And once again, actually we are having a whole other webinar on building equitable communities.
Yes.
but I wanted to also make sure that we address
I only can explain that personally because I am currently like trying to. So when I moved home, I came back to Houston after 25 years last January. And I was like, I'm just going to move here. I'm going to hang out with my mom for a little while. And then I'm going to buy something right next to her. That is not a done deal, right? And part of the thing that I think is very interesting about this, I mean, I've lived in gentrifying neighborhoods in Philadelphia and in Columbus, Ohio. And the thing about it always is sometimes the way that people talk about new neighborhoods, first of all, as if they've never been there before, but they talk about them as if there are no people who matter there already, right? As if just because these houses are run down, these people have chosen to live this way. And so you're actually rescuing some old house, or you're rescuing some neighborhood, or you're rescuing some historical part of town. And I think it's really important to think about the ways in which you enter community, the ways in which you talk to the people in that community. Are there traditions in that community that they've been doing that now that you've moved there, you have a problem with, right? Yeah. I don't know. My mom is on Next Door Neighbor or whatever it's called. And, and it's like, Next Door Neighbor, I don't know anything about it except what my mother tells me about it. And when she talks to me about it, I am like, it is both the best and most horrible place to ever know your neighbors. And part of it is because in ever-changing neighborhoods, everybody comes with different assumptions. And the one assumption I ask people to make is, don't assume that your presence there is the thing that's going to make that neighborhood better. Sure. Or that your decisions about how a long-standing community should be. I'm not saying don't register your opinions, right? Don't talk about things that you think should be improved there. But when you come into a neighborhood where I have been living for my entire life, and then you decide that now we can now have outdoor parties on this street, even though we've had an annual block party for 30 years. It's that kind of thing that really starts to become difficult. And that's not just in Houston, that's in any place where I've ever lived. And part of that is about, are you moving into a neighborhood, or are you moving into the neighborhood that it's potentially going to be, right? So if you're moving into a neighborhood, then you move here, you get to know the people who are already here. If you're moving into a neighborhood that it's going to be, then you get to know all of the people who live in the same 3-story townhouses that you live in, and all of the other people are the people you're trying to avoid. It's those kinds of things you have to think about.
Yeah, so there's, and kind of going to your professor of political science, right? Mm-hmm. So there have been a lot of questions about what can we as individuals do, to push elected officials for real policy change. Yes. Right, and this could be on a variety of issues, whether it's about communities, investment in communities, or if it's about education. It's kind of peppered throughout. So what are your thoughts in terms of more of the political activism piece?
Right. Okay. So quickly, I saw something pop up. I haven't even been paying attention to this, about how corporations and organizations can help in mitigating this gentrification thing. And a lot of that is investment in communities. I remember when I got my first bank account. And I got my first bank account because Nations Bank, it doesn't even exist anymore, but Nations Bank put a bank at the corner of OST and Scott. And it was one of the first banks to actually be in our neighborhood that was like a nationally known bank. And so I went there when it opened to get my account. And then I banked with that, whoever bought that, and then whoever bought that for the next 15, 20 years. And so the thing is, if you invest in those communities as they are, why doesn't this neighborhood deserve, some kind of healthy option? Why wouldn't Whole Foods put a Whole Foods in a place where people actually need good produce? It's those kinds of things. Why wouldn't a Trader Joe's be in Third Ward? Those are the kinds of questions I think people need to ask themselves. Now, about politics, because that really is my thing. Since it's 2020, I want to, the thing that I think that people should be paying most attention to is the vote, not how you should vote. Like not who you should vote for, but how voting is going to be in this season. And it's very unclear what that's going to look like. And I think we need to pay attention to how we are making sure that this voting season is as fair and as accessible as it possibly can be. And as you know, Prairie View is a place that has experienced a ton of voter suppression over the last 30 years. Like literally it has gone to the Supreme Court around voter suppression of student rights. It's Prairie View and a case that went before the Supreme Court that allows students to vote where they go to college across the nation. And so we are very much focused on voter suppression and the ways in which efforts to have votes counted don't always get counted, or their effort to vote doesn't always come as an appreciated participation in democracy. And so we should be thinking about, will there be enough early voting facilities? Will they be safe enough? Will seniors, who are our most reliable voting group in any racial group, will they feel comfortable going to the polls? Those are the kinds of things that we should think about. But I also think that we don't give enough credit to how important it is to send notes to our city council people, to call our city council people, to talk to our state reps. The thing is, they get much less contact. And so because they get much less contact, each individual contact is more impactful, right? And so if there's something that's happening in your neighborhood, who are you telling about it, right? Because there's next door neighbor isn't in fact going to fix most of it. I don't know why I'm saying that. It's just, anyway, I hear a lot of stories about that on a daily basis, but that's not going to be the thing that's going to fix it. It's whether or not you told your city council person, right? It's whether or not you told the person who is your state rep, and are you paying attention to the things that they do? So for instance, in the primary, right? When was it? It seems so long ago, but in February, when we were voting in the primaries, there was a rule that the state made that said, if you used voting machines in the early voting, you couldn't use them on election day. Why? That just makes lines longer, right? We currently in the state of Texas, we don't allow people to use the same machines, whether or not you're voting Republican or Democrat. What that means is, in a neighborhood like where I live, where the vast majority of the people are African American, which means we know that the vast majority of them are going to be Democrats, then sometimes you have lines of people waiting, and then you have 5 machines empty because they're meant for Republicans. Why can't we just use all of those machines to make this a faster process? So I really am for people paying attention to what's happening, particularly at the local level, because it turns out that that is where most of your bread and butter issues are going to be decided. That's where they're going to be decided, things that matter to you, like heavy trash, and how come when it floods, you're the last people to have the debris picked up, and like what if you want a stop sign. Those are the things that are going to be local. That's right, Sharon. Not all Black people are Democrats, but the vast majority of them are. So 94% of Black women voted for Hillary Clinton, and 87% of Black men voted for Hillary Clinton. And so they're not all Democrats, but the point is, why can't we all use those machines so you have 13 machines available to whoever is there, rather than 9 machines for one and 4 for other? I'm about making, I'm all about making access to democracy more accessible for everybody, right? No matter what your political view is, because voting is the one way that all of us get to express our content or discontent with the government, our preference for certain things, or our dislike for certain things. And so we want as many people to register what they think about that, because the last thing the thing that the founders talk about, and the thing that we are not interested in, is a tyranny of the majority, right? Is a tyranny of this sort of majority of people who we believe think a thing, but we don't actually know. And so it's better for us to know what people believe. And so it's better for us to give people access to the vote, right? Rather than having less participation. I'm for more of that. Also, go to city council meetings. You'll learn what's going to happen in your city. If you want to know what's going to happen.
Watch it online now.
Oh, right. So if you want to learn what's going to happen in Houston 10 years from now, then you should be going to those city council meetings. I used to make my students go all the time when I taught Intro to American Government. Yeah. They would be like, they were talking about some stadium they're going to build in 2035. I'm like, that doesn't mean anything to you until you live where that stadium is going to be. And then you'll wish you had known that. So yeah, go to city council. Watch city council meetings.
You know, in the last minute or so that we do have, just to summarize a lot of the questions that we've gotten, it's really about that tangible, actionable piece, whether it's home, or and so you've mentioned some before, right? Which is basically open your eyes, ask questions, ask why, show up. And
Yes.
so, and that can be applied in a lot of different places. I
Right.
know there are questions about resources, which we'll send out, I believe, in a recap,
Yes.
any, helpful resources that, Dr. Price has shared with us
I
as
mean,
well.
it's really about, I think, in the end, Jenny, thinking about, lots of us believe that our lives are more diverse than they actually are, right? When the vast majority of most people, that's not about whites, that's not about people who are particularly racist, the vast majority of all of us live in communities that are homogenous, that live in communities that look like us, that we worship in places where most of the people look like us. We swim at a Y where most of the people look like us. And so if you really want, it's not about having to go out, rush out and find a Black friend or rush out and find an Asian friend. I mean, I'm telling you right now, most Black people would be like, wait a minute, that's a strange request that you just need one. I'm going to be that person. It's not about that. It's about not just whether you interact with people across racial groups, it's how you interact with them. If the only time you interact with people who are different from you is when they're serving you in a restaurant, or they're cleaning your house, or they're the janitor at the building where you work, then what are the lessons you learn about how you interact with people of color? And so if the only time your children see people of color is if it's people who cut your yard, or if it's the person who cleans your house, or if it's the person who gives them their food at McDonald's, what are you telling your children about how you should interact with people of color? That's why it's so important to actually have real relationships with people across racial lines. I mean, I have a friend that I've been friends with since high school, and not just during this period. I mean, we've been doing it more during this period, but for years now, we have been talking about, she'll be like, yeah, she's white, I should say that. And we both grew up poor. So she was white and poor, and I was Black and poor. And she'll say, look, I feel like I want to say this, but I don't feel like it's appropriate, right? And I'll say, because I love her and she is a person that I am good friends with, I'll say, I wouldn't say it like that. Or I say, here's how I would take that if you said it. I can't tell you what to say. But you can't have those kinds of conversations with people across racial lines unless you know them and trust them kind of on a deeper level, not just because I sit next to you every day. So just because you sit next to a Black person every day or sit next to a Latino every day, it doesn't mean that that person is even your friend. But it also doesn't mean that you then have a diverse life if when you leave the job, everything else you do looks a particular kind of way. But it takes a while. I don't know how people build those relationships outside. I mean, lots of mine come from childhood, come from college, those kinds of things. But if you build those kinds of relationships, it makes your life better. And in moments like this, you don't then have to scramble around to figure out why people are thinking this way, because you might have been having discussions about the things that Black Lives Matter, the things that groups are protesting about right now. You would have had a heads up because this has been going on for quite some time.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Price, thank you for the time today. I know you need to get to your class. Your students may be waiting, but they just flashed the poll up on the screen. So attendees who are still able to hang on, please go ahead and vote.
Thank you so much for having me, Jenny. This was very nice. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Yeah. We're very happy that we can be able to provide a platform for these conversations. We know that it's not something, like you said, you don't just turn to your coworker and start talking about this. So, it's not always the easiest topics to approach, but they also are, the most important conversations to have.
Because it's also deeply emotional, and all of us have been traumatized by race in particular kinds of ways. Maybe you said something accidentally that turned out to be super racist and you didn't mean to. Maybe, somebody called me something on the street before I saw you that has led me not to trust you. There are all kinds of things at work, but the best things happen when you work through those things, right?
Absolutely.
When you move through those, but you have to be sort of vulnerable to the process. Everybody, not just the person who is the person of color bearing the brunt of the work, trying to help you come out of your racist shell. Like nobody wants to do that.
That's a really important point to end on, is that the work needs to be, you know, kind of on the individual that has, the desire needs to be there to
right.
work. And so I'll close with just some kind of, I think, closing items in terms of the next steps. We have, there were actually a lot of questions on education and racial inequities, and so we have a panel on that next week. On the 15th, there's one on health and racial inequities. The 22nd will be on developing equitable communities. As many of you all know, the partnership has a very big economic development priority, and so that's an important conversation for us. And finally, on the September 29th, we will be looking at what the business community's role in addressing racial inequities should be. And so these were all things that we kind of touched on a little bit in our conversation, but we'll take a deeper dive. Really, the purpose of today was to have sort of that kickoff foundational conversation. For some, it may be you know, reinforcing things that they knew, and others, we hope that there were kind of perhaps a different perspective that was shared today that you can now take further and dig deeper into, and those additional resources will be provided, as well as a recording of this webinar will be posted on our website for One Houston Together, and then there will be a recap that was sent to all registered attendees. So with that, we'll close. I know we went a little bit over. Thank you everybody for attending. Hope to see you all next Tuesday, and thank you, Dr. Price.
Thank you so much.
Yep, thank you. Bye.